I feel like within the media, I feel like we see a lot of information about, how to prevent suicide, if you're dealing with suicide or suicidal thoughts. But your article is specifically called To Suicide Loss Survivors, so the people who are left behind. I'm really intrigued. Like, what inspired you to write this article?
Yeah, I'm so glad that I loved your intro. Thank you so much. Just because you're right, this topic, these individuals aren't talked about. They're kind of lost in kind of mental health. And so the reason why I wrote this article is because I've had lots of clients who have come to me and just wanted help with grieving and working through losing someone that they love, that they care about from suicide. And also, this type of situation has a lot of stigma attached to it. So a lot of people that have lost someone from suicide, they will isolate. They won't talk to other people. So I really wanted to give them a voice and wanted to reduce some of the stigma around this topic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that is what's important about the mental health community. It's really giving a voice to things that people aren't sure how to talk about or what to do.
Right.
So I know the title is To Suicide Loss Survivors. Is there anyone outside this topic that you wrote the article for, or was it just intended for those people?
Um, it was mostly intended for those people, just individuals who have lost someone they loved, that they cared about, a friend to suicide. And I think it's important, just the reason why they're called survivors, because the grieving process is very different than other types of loss, like questioning why, or could I have done something more, really sets them apart. And so I think it's so important that they're called survivors, just because what they have to deal with through the grieving process. But I think it also can give light to just what it's like surviving something, or what it's like surviving losing someone who chose to take their own life.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that you're trying to create a label that's helpful to, like, I think, to bring more awareness into all of the maybe confusing emotions that go into it, versus like, because if you lost someone, it's not necessarily your fault, but when someone, you lost to suicide, that survivor aspect, like you were kind of left behind and wondering, what happened.
Exactly.
Um, so in your article, you do mention 5 ways that suicide loss survivors how they tend to cope with loss. Do
Yeah.
you mind explaining, breaking down those 5 different ways and then giving advice on each of them?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the first way that I talked about is just the shock. Usually, when someone hears that someone that they love, that they care about, had passed away due to suicide, they don't want to believe it. They question the validity of the information. They may also try to go to different places where that person was, just to make sure they're not there, just to question, it's like, is this accurate? They may even want to like fight with that person, like, that cannot be my loved one, my friend would never do this. They may be even refuse to believe it was suicide, trying to find another way, or find, no, something else had to happen. And so that shock is there. But there are some people that may be listening to this that it wasn't a shock. Maybe they've had a loved one or a friend who has dealt with suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, mental health issues. And so unfortunately, it's not a surprise. They actually maybe are going more toward what we'll talk about in just a minute, about like asking the why, and asking like, what could I have done more for my loved one, my friend. Just advice I would give for this specific step is just allow yourself to experience that shock. It is a part of the process. And even just to validate that, of course you would be shocked. No one wants to lose someone they love or care about to suicide. And you don't know how to grieve, or like, what's next? Will I ever be able to go back to normal? So yeah, so that's with shock.
Okay.
Yeah, the second piece of like grieving and like coping that I talked about was asking why. And this is something that individuals who are listening are survivors. They may have either like avoided this question, they don't want to face it, or maybe they continuously ask themselves this, why did this happen? And in reality, if they would really like admit it to themselves, it's just something that they're trying to focus on so they don't have to focus on the painful emotions that go into losing someone by suicide. And it can be really difficult to identify the why of suicide. A lot of times people will think that it's a very sudden event, but in all reality, very few suicides are a sudden event. Usually a catalyst happens that kind of catapults someone to really contemplating suicide, and then they complete it. But before that happens, there's been a lot of different events that has led to that catalyst. And like the survivors of suicide loss, they can focus on that catalyst as like, that's why they committed suicide when their family member committed suicide. But in reality, there was a lot of other things, pain and hurt that went into that.
Okay.
And so it's helpful to also know or understand about why people would attempt or commit suicide, is that they're trying to end a lot of pain rather than ending their life. And so having suicide loss survivors know that can kind of help with the process. Another question or another thing that suicide loss survivors really think about is, I should have known. And this is something that's very specific and unique to grieving someone you've lost from suicide. Just because survivors of suicide loss will go through all their interactions they had with their loved one, with their friend before they completed suicide, and ask and just dig through, what did I miss? What could I have done? Just to try to like make themselves feel better, or just try to figure out what happened. But, and this next part may be really hard to hear, but really the only people that are responsible for completed suicide is that friend or loved one that actually decided to end their life. And so unfortunately, you have to look at that piece of, my loved one, my friend was in so much pain that they chose to do that. And that's so difficult. And so I really would encourage people to, if they are struggling with loss of someone they love, care about from suicide, really seeking out individual counseling, because navigating, asking why, I should have known, those are really heavy things to deal with on your own. And a lot of survivors will want to isolate themselves, but that's really not what's helpful to them.
I have a quick question. So you're right, because like after reading your article, I think that was really, because I was kind of reminded of like the stages of grief that people go to when they lose, a loved one or something else that's very significant in their life. But it seemed very specific, like the I should have known aspect. So when people are grieving, as a counselor, like, do you like go with them through those questions? Is it helpful for them to even ask those questions, or is it helpful for them to like just do they do they have to go through those questions in order to accept that? Or I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It is helpful to go through those questions, just because they're experiencing them, they're thinking about them, and if they don't get them out, their mind will go through them, and there'll be more blame and guilt. And so, so if they can share that with someone and feel comfortable, like my counselor, or the person I'm sharing it with, accepts me, and I can ask these questions maybe I've been so afraid to ask, that can help through like acceptance, and then lead to, this is the guilt that I feel, or the blaming of myself, and I want to look at that piece and work through it, and then be able to let it go.
Okay. I like to answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Well, yeah, and you talked about the grief. I mean, definitely grieving with losing someone that you love, care about, to suicide, and everybody grieves differently. There are the stages of grief, and we go through those stages, but maybe it's different than someone else, or you may go back through the stages. It doesn't have to look the same for everybody. And if your grief process looks different than someone else's, that's okay. Don't think it has to look exactly the same. I really encourage you to allow yourself to look at the emotions that you experience in the grief. So it might be guilt, it might be blame, it might be sadness, hopelessness, hurt. Acknowledge that you're experiencing those things, and seek counsel from your individual therapist or a support group. And I'll talk about it in a little bit, just some resources for finding support groups for suicide loss survivors. But the most important thing to remember is your grief process may look different than the next person's or someone in your support group, and that's okay. That's okay. And then an emotion that suicide loss survivors experience is anger. And first, all I have to say to that is, of course, you would be angry. You lost someone that you love and you care about. So you may be angry with them, and that might be hard to admit, to look at, because when we lose someone, and by suicide, we try to look at all the good things about them, and that's okay, that's good. But we also have to acknowledge that we lost this person way before we were meant to, way before we wanted to, and we're upset about that. And also there could be anger at yourself, because maybe you do feel like you missed something or something more could have been done. And so that blame and guilt comes back. And to examine those things, I encourage people to write down, like, what are you angry about? And a lot of times in therapy, we will go through those things and we will get angry together about those things and let those out, because anger isn't a bad thing. It's there. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't release it, it's going to come up in ways that we didn't expect.
Mm.
And then just the last piece is I wanted survivors just to realize the resiliency that they have through going through the grief and looking at their emotions. There's resiliency in that, there's strength in that, and not to forget how proud they should be of themselves of working through all of these emotions, and even just having the strength to look at some things inside of them that they're scared to look at, that blame and that guilt, that anger. And most importantly, too, is just not to isolate themselves, going to individual counseling, but also a suicide loss support group. And a couple of good resources for those are the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They have a website, Suicide Prevention Lifeline.org, and they have specific resources for suicide loss survivors, as well as the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. They also have resources for suicide loss survivors that I would just recommend going and looking at and trying to find a support group either close to you or online, because that support is so important and so needed.
Oh, that's awesome. And I appreciate that. Like, you really want, it sounds like you just really want people to have a safe place. Like, if you are a survivor, to
Yes.
express all of the emotions and to go through all the emotions, like not alone, like with
Yes.
someone to bring them out.
Yeah.
Do you like kind of went back to like those stages that are the emotions that people like have to like how they cope with loss? Do you feel like that also tends to like impact like their relationship with God, or feeling like they're really angry with God, or like ask God instead of like maybe redirecting the anger from themselves, but really redirecting it at God and asking him why, or feeling shocked by him? Does that can come up at all?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely anger at the Lord, and it can even kind of change their relationship with the Lord in not spending as much time, or maybe that faith or trust that they had in him dwindles some. And so it's important that that person takes it to the Lord, because we're in relationship with the Lord, and we need to talk with him about the anger and the emotion that we have toward him, and ask that he comes in that with us and speaks to us in those specific situations, so that we can feel his presence and know that despite this difficult event, he's still there with us. We may not have an answer why, or we may not get our loved one back, but we have the Lord with us through that grief. He's never going to leave us. He's always going to be there with us.
Awesome. Yeah. And it's just also good to know that you have someone there to kind of even work through those difficult emotions. I'm sure it's like difficult emotions with the person you lost, and then someone who you felt trusted maybe in, and maybe felt like that got broken. So
Yeah.
I just really appreciate like your heart to go in the mud with people,
Yes.
to kind of go on the other side.
Yes, that's a good word picture of just the mud, because it is mud, it is dirty, but it's good to get in there and work through it.
So what final piece of advice would you give to someone who is a survivor and who is like in the midst of this struggle right now?
Yeah, I would tell them that you're not alone, unfortunately. I mean, we would hope that no one would have to go through this, but there's other people out there that understand your struggle and that want to come alongside you and want to support you as you work through the grief, as you work through all the different emotions. And I would tell them, if you have noticed that you're starting to isolate yourself, make sure that you're reaching out to people that you care about or that understand, or just look for a support group or individual therapist, just because that's going to be most helpful to you as you navigate the things that you've experienced. And just also knowing, like Brittany had said, just like with the Lord, He's there with you. He's not going to leave you, even though it can feel lonely at times.
That makes sense. Well, thank you for that. And thank you just, yeah, for that article and for bringing that all in.